Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we'll drift through a quiet, uneventful piece of English history. No battles, no heroes, just shoes. You don't need to pay close attention. You don't need to remember anything. There's no test, no pressure. Just you, your breath, and a very gentle story. You're safe here. Just lie back. Let your head sink into the pillow. Let the covers rest a little heavier on your chest. And listen to something incredibly unimportant. A story without drama, without consequence, without sharp corners. A story that drifts slowly, like a feather in still air. And somehow, that makes it just right. The year is 1463. The place, England. The weather, possibly cloudy, but we won't worry about that. The topic is pointy shoes and a law that tried to make them less pointy. Yes, you heard that correctly. Tonight's history lesson is about shoes, not revolutions, not kings and queens, but fashion and fabric, leather and limits. It may sound strange, but there is something beautiful about how quiet this story is. No villains, no heartbreak, just rules, shoemakers, and toes. Only leather, laces, and the length of a shoe tip. Take a breath. Let your mind slow down. Let your muscles soften. Let your thoughts wander. Let the day fade away. And let's begin. The year is 1463. Edward IV sits on the English throne. The Wars of the Roses are quietly brewing. But tonight, we don't care about that. We're going to the marketplace, not to buy bread, not to see the blacksmith. We're looking at shoes. There's a chill in the air. Children chasing chickens between carts. A dog naps under a fruit stall. The scent of firewood and old apples hangs in the breeze. The shoemaker's stall is open for business. Leather hangs from hooks. Soles are piled in wooden crates. A boy sweeps sawdust from the path. In this time, fashionable shoes had long, narrow points. They were called poulaines. They came from France. Of course, they did. Some poulaines had tips over 24 inches long. That's longer than most people's arms. They curled upward. They flopped as people walked. They made a soft tapping noise on the cobbled streets. Sometimes they dragged just enough to catch a stranger's glance. They were silly and beautiful and very, very impractical. But fashion has never cared much about practicality. Not in the 15th century. Not now. They weren't made for running or working or walking through puddles. They were made for being seen, admired, judged, envied, maybe. Shoes weren't just shoes. They were a statement. They were art. They were a way of saying, "Look at me. I have time to be uncomfortable. I have money to look foolish and not care." In a world where every step was hard-earned, these shoes whispered, "I do not work with my hands. I do not kneel. I do not rush." Imagine a cobbler, too, hunched in his workshop, rubbing wax into thread, breathing the scent of leather and oil, his fingers rough but precise, making something not just functional, but fashionable. A craftsman in service to silliness, to elegance, to status. The market smells of smoke and roasted turnips. Women barter for eggs. Children laugh and trip in the mud. But in the stall, the shoes wait, pointy, proud, and perfectly ridiculous. And maybe that was the point. Let's take a closer look. Imagine a leather shoe, soft but stiff enough to hold a shape, stitched by hand, by candlelight, by someone with sore fingers, someone who had made many, many shoes, someone whose livelihood depended on fashion, and whose back probably ached more than we will ever know. The front of the shoe stretches and stretches into a sharp point, not just a fashion choice, but a message, a signal to the world, that this person was important or wanted to be seen as important. That point might be stuffed with wool or moss or hay, sometimes even curled up tightly and stitched in place. It had to hold its shape, no matter the weather, no matter the road, no matter the mud or the looks from strangers. Some poulaines were so long, they had to be tied to the knees. Little cords delicately sewn into the hose, a soft tension, keeping the toes from flopping, keeping the image intact. Because if the tips flopped, if they dragged in the dirt, it would ruin the whole look. And in fashion, the look is everything. People wore them to court, to dances, to the marketplace. They stepped carefully, carefully choreographed, a sort of slow-motion elegance, balancing fashion with function, or ignoring function altogether. Imagine a knight walking slowly, wearing long, curling shoes. The armor makes a soft, metallic music. Each step, a careful negotiation between pride and practicality. But it's the shoes that get all the attention. The shoes say everything. They whisper, "I have no need to run. I am not rushing anywhere. I am above haste. I exist to be seen." And the longer the point, the richer you seemed. Because only someone who didn't work could afford to walk so poorly. Only someone far removed from labor could turn walking into performance. Some say poulains were status symbols. Others say they were just ridiculous. And perhaps they were both. Beautiful and absurd. Elegant and excessive. A perfect mirror of the people who wore them. But people wore them anyway, because people always do. We chase style, even when it makes no sense. Even when we trip over it. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. There were rumors, of course, of nobles falling downstairs, of tripping in ballrooms, of broken poulains in the middle of royal dances. But no one cared, because even broken shoes were fashionable. And being fashionable meant more than being steady. And the shoemakers? They just kept making more. Each pair a little longer, a little sharper, until one day, someone in power decided enough was enough. It started quietly, as many laws do. A parchment rolled tightly, a seal pressed with purpose, a signature from someone with very serious handwriting. In 1463, Parliament passed a law about shoes, specifically the length of their toes. No man, unless he was a lord or someone of noble title, could wear shoes with points longer than 2 inches. 2 inches, a tiny, forgettable measure, about the width of a thumb, but to some, it was devastating. To the fashion elite, to the pointy toe lovers of England. This was not a rule. It was an attack. How dare they? Tell people how long their shoes could be. What was next? Hats, sleeves, codpieces. But the law was clear. And it wasn't just a suggestion. It came with fines and, in some places, public shaming. Imagine being stopped in the street, a guard crouching to measure your shoes, a short debate, a long sigh, and then, perhaps, a snip of the toe, right there, in front of everyone. The law was meant to curb extravagance, to bring dignity back to English dress. Or perhaps just to stop people from falling downstairs. But fashion doesn't respond kindly to rules. The longer the toe was forbidden, the more desirable it became. Shoemakers whispered workarounds, secret designs, hidden lengths. They crafted shoes that looked modest, but concealed extra inches inside. Some nobles ignored the law completely, daring the authorities to challenge their feet. Others wore absurdly short poulaines in protest, toeless shoes, half shoes, mocking the very idea of regulation. Enforcement varied. Some towns cared deeply, others not at all. In the countryside, poulaines flourished in secret, hidden beneath long cloaks, or worn proudly at twilight. Churches began to preach against them, declaring them vain, unholy, dangerous to the soul and the ankle. Some said the devil wore pointy shoes, but still, people wore them. Not everyone, of course, but enough to keep the cobblers busy, to keep the nobles fashionable, and to keep the law mostly ignored, because in the end, the law could measure shoes, but it couldn't measure desire. And for a brief, peculiar moment in English history, someone, somewhere, was officially in charge of how pointy your shoes could be. The news spread slowly, from castles to town halls, from parchment to whispers, from whispers to muttering crowds at muddy crossroads. In taverns, the regulars raised their mugs, not in protest, not quite, but in confusion. They want us to measure shoes now? One man asks, staring at his boots like they've betrayed him. Who has time for this? Another grumbles, adjusting his muddy apron. But others are delighted. Finally, one old woman says, now we can see their toes when they run from the rain. A farmer jokes that poulaines are like walking with a fox on each foot. His friends laugh, but quietly, because a merchant nearby is still wearing them. Some try to obey, snipping their shoes with kitchen scissors, creating strange, stubby versions of once grand designs. Some keep wearing their long shoes, but only at home or at night. One boy ties feathers to his shoes to make up for the loss of length. It doesn't catch on, but it's remembered. In the cities, tailors and cobblers hold secret fittings, shoes hidden under cloaks, length measured in silence, transactions made with glances. Fashion becomes a little more thrilling, a little more rebellious. Even children get involved, drawing long shoes in the dirt, pretending to be nobles, making fun of the law, but also wanting those shoes, because even then, style had a way of slipping into the dreams of the young. Not everyone was amused, though. Some townspeople muttered about vanity. That long shoes meant long foolishness. Some priests gave sermons, not just about sin, but about slipping in the snow. One town passed its own rule. Any man found with a shoe over 2 inches would have to donate it to the poor. Of course, no poor man wanted a shoe he couldn't walk in, so the pile of donated poulaines just sat there, gathering dust and confusion. The shoemakers, caught in the middle, adapted. They offered customizations, removable tips, clip-on points for private parties, discreet designs, they called them. A few daring youths made protest shoes, wooden soles shaped like ducks. One even carved little bells into the tips. They jingled through the village until the vicar had enough. And still, the law stood. But people did what they always do. They found ways around it, ways through it, ways to laugh about it over stew and stale beer. Because even the smallest laws can echo when they step on people's toes. While the common folk joked, trimmed, and tucked their shoes, the nobles played a different game. They had tailors on retainer, cobblers who owed them favors, and, more importantly, privacy. Their poulains didn't disappear overnight. They simply evolved. A pointed shoe tucked under flowing robes, a leather tip carefully padded to look short, but unfold it, and it stretched far beyond the legal limit. Some had collapsible tips, little buttons hidden in the lining. With a press, the point would spring outward, like a dagger drawn for style. One duke had a pair made from velvet, stitched with silver thread. The points curled into perfect spirals, but only when warmed by the heat of the fireplace. Another noble woman wore detachable poulains on straps. She would arrive in plain shoes, and then, with a quick slide and click, transform into the fashion icon of the evening. At royal balls, they whispered about the length of each other's shoes, not out of scandal, but out of admiration. "Did you see the Earl's poulains?" they'd ask. "He must be very confident." Sometimes, noblemen would compete, not with swords or speeches, but with steps. Who could glide most gracefully, without tripping or breaking a heel? It became an art form. The longer the shoe, the slower the walk. The more careful the turn, the more impressive the poise. One poet even wrote, "To walk in shoes like sharpened quills is to write your name upon the floor." And so they did, writing their names, not with ink, but with style, in every hallway, every ballroom, every quiet corridor, echoing with the soft, soft tap of long, illegal shoes. Even the servants noticed, sneaking glances as they polished floors the nobles would never touch, watching those ridiculous, beautiful shoes float past, and dreaming, perhaps, of one day wearing a pair themselves, while nobles danced and cobblers whispered secrets. The church was watching, and it did not approve. In the echoing halls of cathedrals, in the flicker of candlelight behind stained glass, clergy began to speak. not just of sins of the heart, but of sins of the foot. Long shoes, they said, were not just foolish, they were dangerous to the soul and to society. Some preachers claimed they were shaped like the devil's claws, that each exaggerated toe was a hook, dragging its wearer toward pride and then to hell. A bishop in York declared, "A man's wisdom ends where his shoe begins." In London, another called them foot lances of vanity, colorful words for colorful footwear. In sermons, priests waved their arms, describing the poulains as sinful distractions, unholy indulgences, a mockery of God's design. They read from Scripture and added their own interpretations, comparing the long shoe to the path of temptation, winding, narrow, and easy to trip on. And so the church began to ban them, not just in churches, but in monasteries, schools, and sacred festivals. One abbey posted a decree: "Shoes beyond 2 inches shall not enter this holy ground." Some monks cheered. Others looked down at their feet and said nothing. In religious art, demons were drawn wearing absurdly long poulains, chasing sinners across crooked bridges of bone, laughing as they tripped on their own fashion. The message was clear. The longer the shoe, the shorter the path to ruin. But not all clergy agreed. Some wore subtle poulains under their robes, just a little fashionable, a little rebellious, a little human. Because even in the house of God, vanity found a corner, and sometimes, in the quiet between prayers, there was the softest sound, a tap, tap of a forbidden toe, brushing the cold stone floor. Where there are laws, there are loopholes. Where something is forbidden, it becomes desirable. And so, in quiet alleys, behind bakeries, beneath the noise of honest trade, a different kind of market began to stir. No signs, no stalls, no shouted prices, just a nod, a glance, a tap on the door. Welcome to the underground world of illegal shoes. In these hidden corners, cobblers worked by candlelight, measuring in silence, cutting leather with care, whispering the length only when the shutters were drawn. There were code words: toes with a twist, extra inches for evening wear. One cobbler offered Sunday soles, shoes short enough for church, but hiding extensions beneath the arch. Nobles sent servants in disguise. Commoners pooled coins. A pair of poulains, properly made, might cost more than a month's rent. Some shoes were smuggled inside sacks of grain, others hidden in bundles of laundry. Once, a pair was baked into a loaf of festival bread, delivered, still warm, to a merchant's door. Risky? Yes. But fashion always is. Authorities tried to crack down. They raided workshops, confiscated stock, measured every pair of shoes in suspicious shops, but still, the trade continued. Because for every cobbler shut down, 2 more popped up in a neighboring village. For every fine paid, there was someone willing to pay double, just to walk with a little more flair. And so, in the shadow of the law, the Poulains lived on, long, impractical, but beautiful, passed hand to hand, worn proudly in secret. They became not just fashion, but defiance, a silent rebellion, one pointed toe at a time. Every fashion, no matter how bold, eventually fades. And so it was with the Poulain. For years, it had ruled the roads, sliced through courts and banquets like a statement of power, mocked by some, adored by others, but always present. Until one day, it wasn't. There was no single moment, no royal decree strong enough to kill the trend outright. No grand fire where all long shoes were burned. Just a slow shift, like seasons changing. So gently, you hardly notice, until the snow is gone. A few nobles began to wear shorter shoes, not out of obedience, but out of boredom. What once made them feel unique, now made them look behind the times. A new silhouette crept in, rounder toes, softer curves, less effort, less spectacle. Shoes you could actually walk in, without planning your route. Young courtiers rolled their eyes at old men clinging to their curled Poulains. In taverns, jokes shifted. No longer about long shoes, but about the men who still wore them. That fellow's fashion is 3 kings old, someone might mutter. And that was enough. Worse than sin was being outdated. The cobblers saw it first. Fewer orders for extra long leather. More requests for quiet shoes. Sturdy soles. A new kind of dignity. The underground markets shrank. The secret passwords faded. One by one, the last long shoes were boxed, stored away, or thrown out with last year's trends. But a few remained, hung like relics in dusty corners, displayed on mantels as conversation pieces, or tucked in trunks, wrapped in cloth, waiting to be remembered. And sometimes, on a rainy day, a child might discover one, pull it on, and laugh as the curled tip bounces down the hall, not knowing that once, this ridiculous thing was everything. So now, as the candle burns lower, and your eyes feel a little heavier, let's return to where we began. Not with drama, not with kings or crowns, but with something much smaller. A law about shoes. Not even about wearing shoes. Just how long the tips could be. A detail. A measurement. 2 inches? It sounds utterly unimportant. And yet, it sparked rebellion. It inspired creativity. It whispered through the marketplace. It tiptoed into churches and strutted through ballrooms with velvet confidence. This little law unfurled across England like a pointed toe, elegant, absurd, easily ignored, but always present. Because even the tiniest rules have a way of finding the corners of our lives. They shape how we dress, how we walk, how we're seen, how we see ourselves. And humans. Well, we respond, not always with swords or protest banners, sometimes with shoelaces, with quiet defiance, with style. That's the quiet beauty of history. The big stories of war, power, and conquest. They shout, but the small stories, the silly ones, they whisper. And whispers are often the ones that stay. The law about poulains didn't last forever. Eventually, it faded. Fashion moved on. The world grew heavier. Other things mattered more. But in a few old texts, and in the dusty corners of memory, that law still lingers. Sometimes, when a pair of shoes feels just a bit too extravagant, or a heel a bit too tall, we're reminded that this has all happened before. The dance between practicality and beauty, the slow waltz of what's allowed, and what we wear anyway. And so tonight, as your breath slows and the day folds gently around you, let this little story drift through your dreams. A story of leather and law, of people being ridiculous, and human, and lovely. Because somewhere in time, someone looked down at a shoe and thought, that point is just a bit too long. And someone else took that as a challenge. Sleep well. Let the laws rest. Let the shoes be long or short, or whatever they want to be. You've walked far enough for one night.